would the naturalised citizens please come forward and receive their certificates of naturalisation from His Worship the Mayor as I call their names. Jose Basleth. Makasima Basleth. Agnes Para. Lena Para. Manda Ristevsky.
This report is about modern Australia, a waltzing Matilda who now tangos, twists, and dances the tarantella to exotic tempos. We shall concern ourselves with the post-war surge of European immigrants, the barren interior land, and Australia's honest effort to draw closer to its Asian neighbors. Australia is an all-white, prospering land in a brown and yellow sea. She is one of the biggest countries in the world and as desolate as she is big. Underpopulated and unexploited, she lives beneath the umbrella of a teeming, bursting Asia.
Australia is an island, a continent, a nation. Yet its population is less than that of Greater New York City. There is no shortage of space. Australia's 11 million people rattle around in an area as big as the United States. About 3/4 live in a small wedge in the southeast. Vast sections of the interior are empty. To fill this void, Australia opened its doors to Europe after World War II. Sydney Harbor took on the look of New York in 1900. There was, of course, nothing startling about the million-odd Britons who entered, but another million migrants, people from Italy, Poland, Austria, Spain, Greece, Malta, Yugoslavia, Holland, brought a new flavor and a new look. They're still coming, learning English, finding jobs, raising families, and by and large, having few regrets. If Australia is not El Dorado, it's surely a vast improvement over the lives they leave behind. Since 1947, Australia has energetically sought these people out. The Australian consulate in Genoa, for example, is one of the busiest offices in that frantic port. Passage is assisted. For a token $56, a man and his wife, children travel free, can make the long voyage east. Just about everyone is welcome, the skilled, the unskilled, the young, the elderly. Everyone except Asians and Africans. The white Australia policy is unyielding, candidly defended, and sometimes diplomatically embarrassing. For all its open space, Australia is a country of big cities. Sydney, over 2 million people. Despite early hopes that the migrants would populate the interior, they have understandably flocked to the cities, where jobs are available and where the atmosphere is like that of congested Central Europe. Melbourne, with not quite 2 million, is the most British of Australian cities. But beneath the Anglo-Saxon veneer, Latin temperaments bubble. Teutons and Slavs are taking root. Canberra, Australia's national capital, is a made-to-measure city like Brasilia. The sense of isolation is strong here, only 67,000 people, few migrants. On the other hand, prosperous industrial towns like Wollongong, a steel center, are filled with new Australians. It's mainly heavy industries, steel, autos, mining, that have absorbed the migrants. Renato Lagasse, on the left, is a typical success story. He's a Slovene who came to Australia on an Italian passport 12 years ago. He worked first as a sugar cutter in Queensland. Then he took the lowest job at Port Kembla, a sweeper in the yards. Today, he is an assistant foreman at one of the giant steel furnaces. Renato is one of an army of Central Europeans who keep Australian industry operating. The duty roster tells the story. Anglo-Saxon names are absent. Smith and Jones have gone elsewhere. The The Renato Lagassis have replaced the older Aussie in many industries. The Anglo-Saxon has moved up to supervisory posts or white-collar work. Renato is satisfied. He earns $78 a week, one of the highest wage scales in the world. Moreover, he has an identity as an Australian, which pleases him. He owns his own car, his own house. For Renato is not merely from Middle Europe, he is Middle Europe. Observe the Wollongong supermarket where Franca Lagassi shops. Food is plentiful, variety infinite, efficiency rules. The cozy neighborhood delicatessen with its foreign cheeses is ignored. Mass merchandising is an inevitable part of the new, prospering Australia.
Good morning, everybody. This is VJC, the Royal Flying Doctor Service, Broken Hill. It's medical time now. Station's wanting doctor. Come in, please.
Hello, Joe. Like Wallace?
90F Dorado, 90F. 18A came and out of mines, 18A came and out of mines.
92 come wire.
Just stand by, please. We're getting doctor for you now.
9SU Coomber, will you come in, please? Over.
The three-engine plane and the airborne doctor are the new symbols of the outback. Hard-working ranchers, farmers, and miners inhabit the great dead heart, and they need medical care. Dr. Robert North and his colleagues at Broken Hill cover an area 1.5 times as big as Texas, 500,000 square miles. The difficulty of supplying basic services to the outback dwellers has given Australians second thoughts about expansion. This land is as dry as the Sahara. There are several gigantic irrigation projects underway, but their output will be quickly absorbed. The Flying Doctors are a non-profit group. In many ways, they represent what is most admirable in the Australian character, and in particular, the Australian of the outback. There is a sense of self-reliance, a willingness to help, an obligation to others. It invites memories of and satisfies the nostalgia for our own simple frontier society. The hum of the tri-motor is a reassuring sound to the rancher, whose home may be 200 miles from any other civilized outpost. The Thomas Ranch at Lonsdale, 170,000 acres, 8,000 sheep. The patient Bob North is calling on, Jim Thomas Sr., is an outback pioneer. In his youth, illness at one of these isolated stations could often mean death. Today, the Flying Doctors can be raised in a minute or two by radio, by day and night, and generally a lot faster than you can get a position in New York City on a Friday. More than 1,500 stations are serviced by the Flying Doctors. Over a third of Australia has no other medical service except the airborne physician. Often, a patient will be examined, taken aboard the plane, and transferred to a hospital bed in less time than it takes in a big city. It's easy to admire the Flying Doctors. At the same time, their existence makes one poignantly aware of the terrible emptiness of most of Australia, the loneliness and desolation of much of the country. All the boosterish visions of big cities and flowing water in the Australian interior must be viewed with caution. The dryness, the flatness, the wind, and the flies may long prevail over any grandiose schemes.
Well, come on, children. It's time for school now.
In the outback, doctors fly, and school lessons are broadcast. A unique institution, the School of the Air, looks after the education of the ranchers' children. Philip and Cheryl Thomas get their schooling via shortwave radio.
Good morning, girls and boys. How are you this lovely, fine spring morning? Fit and well, I hope.
This is Mrs. Phyllis Gibb, member of the British Empire, principal of the Broken Hill School of the Air.
So we might change now to a word game and see how well you can do with that. You think of them quickly, and then if there's a word that you don't know, you can write them down. The soldier walked down the road. A better word than walked in that sentence. Could you tell me, Ivan? At.and, ISU.
Strutted.
Yes, that is quite a good word to use. What did you think of Ron at 8 NDV? Evan?
8 NDV marched. Over.
Yes, marched is a good word. Think of a better one for me. Have you thought of one, Philip, at 8 PT? Evan?
Trudged. Over.
Good boy. Trudged is a good word. 8 PT, I think Cheryl had one. Evan?
8 PT trotted, Mrs. Gibb.
Yes, trotted, that's another one. 8 NDV, yes, Ron. Evan?
8 NDV plotted. Over.
And plodded is another one. Well, those were all good words for that sentence. Now let's look at this one. This is a harder one. You'll have to think about this one. The baby walked slowly towards me. Have you thought of one? I wonder if Ivan has one. Everton ISU.
Stumbled. Over.
Yes, stumbled would be quite a good word. Have either of the children at 8 PT thought of one, Evan?
No, Mrs. Gibb.
And I told you it was a hard one. Have you, Ron, at 8 NDV, Evan?
8 NDV toddled. Over.
Yes, that's a very good one, too. Has anyone thought of a different one, Evan?
Ernie Singleton is one of a quiet brotherhood of Australians who find the brooding silences of the never-never land attractive. He is, by choice, a boundary rider, charged with the maintenance of the longest fence in the world. This is the wild dog fence, 3,000 miles of high wire barrier designed to keep the vicious dingo out of sheep country. Ernie's job is to repair 60 miles of it to shoot and trap wild dogs. He and his family often go for days without seeing anyone else. Ernie likes his job. Like many Australians, he's fascinated with the prospect of going it alone. The fence, the red dust, the mulga tree, and the salt bush, these are his world. Once a year, Ernie gets a 2-week vacation. He takes his wife and son to Sydney to see the big town and usually gets bored in a few days. He finds Sydney confining. His stretch of fence, the hot, clear sky, and the red dirt are more to his liking. There was a time when it was fashionable to speculate about Australia eventually absorbing 100 million people. These optimistic estimates are being steadily revised downward. 25, 30 million is the current maximum of which people speak. The inhospitable desert with its sparse vegetation, its arid stretches, its merciless sun, may put a cruel break on even that modest figure. For years to come, the dead heart may prove hearth and home only to the rugged likes of Ernie Singleton.
Building up its population and making the land livable are 2/3 of Australia's problem. There remains the hard fact that Australia is much closer to Japan than to either England or America. The distance from Indonesia to Darwin is far less than the distance from Darwin to Sydney. In trade, diplomacy, cultural relations, and that broad, vague area called international goodwill, Australians are now taking a second look at their neighbors, a look long overdue in the opinion of many Aussies.
For one thing, Asia is now in Australia's backyard. This is New Guinea. Half of the island belongs to Indonesia and Sukarno, whose reputation as a nice neighbor is questionable. The other half is run by Australia, partly as a UN trust, partly as a territory. No one quite knows where to find the border between Sukarno's real estate and Australia's. Surveying parties have made half-hearted attempts to locate it. But no matter where it is, the uneasy fact remains. Australia now shares a common boundary with an Asian nation. Thus far, there have been no incidents. Australians pray it stays that way. White Australia. This means colored people are not welcome, except for businessmen, diplomats, and a few others. Despite this rigid color bar, more than 10,000 Asian students have been welcomed on special visas to Australian universities. Many come under the auspices of the Colombo Plan. At the Australian National University in Canberra, 3 Asian students gave some frank and tolerant comments to reporter David Burke.
It's about time Australia discovered its neighbors. I think that Australia is eventually to be a part of Southeast Asia and of the Pacific region, but this is a fact which had been obscured in the past because the countries of this region were tied individually to European countries and didn't have very much to do with one another.
The Australians here have a very high standard of living, and I think they're very afraid of an influx of Asians into this country who will compete and work for lower wages. I think for this reason they don't want their standard of living suppressed.
Obviously, the Asian countries are not expecting that they will solve either their overpopulation problem or their unemployment problem by dumping people onto Australia. It's merely a question of a gesture which Australians might make towards neighbors that they don't discriminate against us as such.
It has been noticed particularly since the common market in Europe came into being. Australia felt that by allying itself with Asia, she would be more economically viable in this part of the world.
No longer is Britain Australia's one big customer. Britain is one customer amongst many. Her proportion of importance to Australia as a market has declined heavily since before the war. And in her place has come a great expansion of our trade with Asia, and in Asia with Japan. Japan is not yet Australia's biggest customer. Last year she was Australia's second biggest customer. But in the future, it's confidently expected that Japan will become to Australia what Britain was to her before the war. The Britain of the Far East, Australia's big, growing, and most important customer. Australia has no diplomatic relations with Communist China. But Australians see no inconsistency between this fact and the fact that we're conducting a very large trade with Communist China. Last year, our exports to that country amounted to some $150 million. As evidence of Australia's desire to increase her trade with Red China, the Australian wool industry has already sent technicians into Red China to train the Chinese in wool textile technology. We're already sending steel to China, and various metals are also going there. And long term, there are great hopes in Australia for the expansion of the Chinese market as a possible second Japan.
The challenges implicit in changing Matilda are enormous. The absorption of millions of Poles and Italians and Greeks into an Anglo-Saxon society. The conquering of the great dead heart. The uneasy new friendships with Japan. The overtures to Red China. All of these are heavy burdens for a nation of 11 million living in outlandish isolation. Yet the Australian enters these contests well armed, not with nuclear warheads or aircraft carriers, but with certain remarkable traits of national character. They're worth looking at.
First, a love of their land. Listen to David Campbell, former RAF pilot, rancher, and one of Australia's leading poets.
The sun was in the summer grass. The cooler bars were twisted steel. The stockman paused beneath their shade and sat upon his heel. And with the reins looped through his arm, he rolled tobacco in his palm. His horse stood still, his cattle dog tongued in the shadow of the tree. And for a moment on the plain, time waited for the three. And then the stockman licked his fag and time took up his soulless swag. I saw the stockman mount and ride across the mirage on the plain, and still that timeless moment brought fresh ripples to my brain. It seemed in that distorting air, I saw his grandson sitting there.
Another national trait, a respect for the right to be heard, the right to sound off in the best English tradition. This is Australia's Hyde Park, the Domain in Sydney.
Without you say humanism right through the world, and humanism with the first blank question of security for need from the cradle to the grave.
Got work were paid very small amounts, and yet today, only 46 years later, they're a country that's leading the world that all the capitalist countries are very frightened of. Because in the
15 million slave laborers in Siberia, eating their hearts out, and bad straight to the short ration.
In the capitalist countries of the world today, who's frightened of the big... Who's frightened?
Finally, a rare courage. We're at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. In 2 world wars, in Korea and elsewhere, the Australian has demonstrated a bravery and a capacity for self-sacrifice, which does honor to all free men. Australians have little time for military strutting and less for authority. Yet in terms of their numbers, they have suffered one of the highest casualty rates in the world. At.a, Gallipoli, Lone Pine, Buna, Tobruk,
Populate or perish is the way the politicians, journalists, and other Cassandras define Australia's dilemma. The dock worker in Woolloomooloo or the jackaroo on the sheep station is far less pessimistic. He has no intention of perishing, populated or not. And that urge to increase may indeed be limited by the continent's dryness. It follows that Australia, small in numbers, white-skinned, industrialized, must find ways to live with Asia. A start has been made, and it has surprised many by its good omens. For one thing, the sensitive Indian or Japanese has reacted extremely well to the Australian, whom they see as an outgoing bloke free of the stigma of colonialism. True, the white Australia policy is an anchor dragging on a nation eager to sail in Asian seas. Some token immigration of Asians as a beau geste may be in the offing. With all, the Australian prospect is an exciting one. With natural wealth, energy, a solid basis in British law, and a friendliness as assertive as their beer, the Australian may yet play a crucial role in Asia. As a bridge between white and colored peoples, between former colonial masters and subjects, between the industrialized and the evolving. They'll certainly give it a good try, or as any fair dinkum-dinky-die Aussie would say, let's give it a burl. This is Chet Huntley reporting.